Mhm.
Thank you all for attending our Lunch and Learn today. Our hopes is that today's session will prove to be educating and enlightening. This Lunch and Learn is brought to you by Latino Leadership Network and by our DEI subcommittee. We'd also like to give special thanks to DIN, Disability Inclusion Network, for collaborating with us on this. Also, advanced thanks goes out to Rene Morales, Flora Estrada for being a part of Lunch and Learn, and Jocelyn Nelson with DIN. As we go along today, if you have any questions that you'd like to ask during the Q&A session, you can either put them in the chat and we will copy them down, or state them in the or copy them down and state them in the Q&A session, or you can raise your hand during our question and answer part of the program. If you need closed captioning, as Jocelyn mentioned a moment ago, please go to the three dots, click there. It says more, I believe, and then go to show subtitle. This will get you to your subtitles. In addition, if what you can do is you can hover over the subtitles as they're going, and you can drag them wherever you'd like, so it's more readable to you. Today's session, as I mentioned, we will be having three speakers, and I will begin with our introduction. How often do we think about traveling through life, going about our daily tasks, not giving a thought to what we can't do? I know that for me, I really think about these things when I'm injured or sick. Even the slightest injury causes a big disruption for me. I've had sciatica twice in my life. It's rendered me flat on my back, hardly able to get out of bed. I remember thinking, once I'm better, I'm never going to take my health for granted. What actually happens, though, is I get better and go back to not even thinking or appreciating moving through life with ease. If you're a person with a disability, though, oftentimes there is no getting better. The CDC estimates that 1 in 4 Americans live day to day with a disability, which includes physical, mental, learning, or psychological disabilities. Think about how you feel when you heard the word disabled. Does it make you feel pity, like you want to help, like you want to run away? In our country, like many around the world, disabilities are something we don't talk about enough, that we speak about in hushed tones, or that we feel shame about. Again, think about something. If you're someone that lives with a disability on a daily basis, how are you going to feel in this situation? If you know if people are tiptoeing around the fact that you have a disability, how do you feel when people look at you or treat you differently? Living in our own skin, we're aware of our abilities and strengths, just as we're aware of our disabilities and weaknesses. Wouldn't it be nice if people would recognize us for these strengths and abilities? Wouldn't it be nice if we could talk about disabilities like we talk about what we're going to have for dinner tonight? How do we want to be valued? How do we want our place in society to be? Today, we have a great presentation for you. Rene Morales will be sharing his story in living with trigeminal neuralgia, the silent disease. Jocelyn Nelson will be educating us about disabilities in general and will be sharing data with us. And Flora Estrada will be sharing her story regarding family members with a disability. So with that, I would like to introduce to you Rene Morales.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rene Morales, and I work for your Washington State Department of Veterans Affairs. I'm here to talk about a rare nerve disorder called trigeminal neuralgia. 3 years ago, actually today, I was diagnosed with this condition. It's a very painful nerve condition and has actually been described as some of the worst pain that a human can feel. And unfortunately has the nickname as the suicide disease because there are people who would rather kill themselves than live with this condition. 3 years ago, when this happened, I was struck with pain that I struggle still to be able to describe. The trigeminal nerve is in the brain and runs along the face in three areas, which is like here towards your face, your jaw, so forth. I have it in the upper area. So whenever I'm in contact with anything here, if I touch my forehead, water raining on me from a shower, drying off with a towel, putting on a shirt, shaving my head, I would feel these electric shocks, as if two live wires were connected together.
Oh,
Renee, you're muted.
Wow, that really didn't help things. So thank you for catching that. I apologize for not catching that sooner. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rene Morales. I work for your Washington State Department of Veterans Affairs. Uh, 3 years ago today, I was diagnosed with trigeminal neuralgia. Trigeminal neuralgia is a very rare nerve disorder. And basically what happens is the trigeminal nerve, which is in the brain, runs along the face in three areas, towards the forehead, the cheek, and the jaw. In the brain, the nerve is in contact with an artery, which then creates these painful electric shocks, as if you're putting two live wires together. And the shocks are incredibly painful. Uh, it's literally being electrocuted. And when I am in the grips of this pain, you will actually see me clenching down because I really am being electrocuted. Uh, this disorder is hard to describe to people, because how do you describe what it's like to be electrocuted unless you've been electrocuted? Uh, it comes without warning. It can also come from touching my head, uh, water from taking a shower, shaving my head, putting a shirt on. If it just touches a certain area just right, it triggers these shocks that are anywhere from 10 seconds to 30 seconds. Um, when this happened 3 years ago, and once I was diagnosed with this, I went into a deep depression, because I just couldn't imagine having something that was going to affect me for the rest of my life. I mean, there's medication and there's brain surgery. Those are really my two options. The medication has its own issues, because the side effects can be very harmful, quite honestly. I really didn't know how to deal with this at first. I isolated myself from my family. I didn't want my family to see me in pain. And so for months, I would just stay in my room and became disconnected from my family. I struggled with my negative thinking. I struggled with how to deal with this. I didn't know what type of future I was going to have, because I didn't even know if I was going to be able to work. My wife quit her job because she felt that she was going to have to stay home and help me through all of this. And fortunately for her, she is a therapist and was able to have a private practice that she relocated to the house to be there for me, to support me. The thing was, is I didn't let that support in. I just had the biggest pity party a person could really have, because I was just so focused on being diagnosed with something that it was just terrible. In my mind, it was terrible. It was just, I didn't know what to do. To look at me now, when we talk about disabilities, as Steve mentioned, when we think about what a disability is, there are certain images that come to mind. When you look at me, you don't see somebody who's struggling with a disability. That's why we call it an invisible disability. There are people who struggle with an assortment of disorders that you would never know that they have, and are suffering in their own ways that can be unimaginable. I am fortunate that after seeing 4 neurologists and advocating hard to find treatment that would work, I do feel that I'm in more control of the disorder now. I still suffer from painful shocks. I still have issues when I do touch my head and trigger shocks. It's the old saying, it hurts when I do this. Well, then don't do that. I mean, that's basically what I've come to learn, is just don't touch my head. And so I'm in a better place. But for a lot of people who struggle with disabilities, they may not be out of that pity party. And it's so important to manage your own thinking when you're diagnosed with an invisible disorder, a condition that maybe is incurable. Um, Struggling with something like this, it's a challenge for not just yourself, but for your family, because as I struggled through going through what I was going through, my family was also struggling. They didn't know how to approach me. They didn't know how to deal with me. Uh, it just made everybody really uncomfortable. And then there are times when, like for me, my family lives in San Antonio, Texas. And one time I went home to go see them. And the first time I saw my parents looking at me in pain, I struggled deeply with it. Uh, I didn't like this sense of feeling in some ways pitied, but that was my own thinking, and that wasn't what people were thinking. But in my own mind, I guess this machismo sense of wanting to be strong, wanting to show strength in ways that nothing affects you, you got to let that go, because you cannot allow yourself to think like these things, because the reality of it is you've got to be able to embrace your life regardless of what the situation is. And I still crack up. I had an uncle when I was at home, and he went to like lay hands on my forehead, like he wanted to lay hands and pray, and then it triggered it, and then he had this look on his face like, oh my God, what did it, and so again, it's just people will have their own ways of understanding what's going on and how to deal with it. And I just find that don't hide from what it is that you have. Be open, be honest, let people know what you're having. I didn't do that at first. I was very secretive about what was going on with me until the point where there was just no way to hide it. I mean, you would see me in pain. You would see me physically having seizures. So once I sought out help, once I talked to my supervisors and got the support needed, um, I'm happy to say that 3 years later, I'm still a state employee. I'm still happily working for WDVA, and I still am so thankful to be where I am because of that support, because I have such wonderful supervisors and a wonderful director that has done anything and everything to ensure that I have the support needed to deal with what I'm going through. So whenever you're faced with a situation with a disability, don't allow yourself to fall into negative thinking. Don't allow yourself to not see a future, because there is a future. There can be a future. Reach out to those who can help you. Talk to your supervisors. Look into all the different programs that are available to you to help you get through. If you're not receiving the best medication or the best treatment, go somewhere else. Find a different doctor. Do what you can to advocate for yourself and take care of yourself. We all struggle. We all have the things that we have to battle. It doesn't have to be as hard. And, there are going to be days that I still struggle and I still have a hard time dealing with what I'm dealing with. But, I allow myself to have that day and I move on, and I realize how thankful I am that I haven't succumbed to thinking that my life is over and that I really have nothing else to look forward to. So with that, I thank you for your time. And if you have any questions, I believe we're asking people to put those in the chat box. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Renee. Really appreciate that. And yes, if you do have questions, again, you can raise your hand at the end in the Q&A session, or you can drop them in the chat and we'll copy them down and ask them for you as well. And our next speaker is going to be Jocelyn.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jocelyn. I'm the current chair of the Disability Inclusion Network. I am also a person with some disabilities. I have complex PTSD. I suffer from chronic migraines, which is usually about 10 to 12 migraines a month. And I have a other variety of enabling disabilities like anxiety and depression. I also have a unique family background where my sister is a person with Down syndrome, and I have a brother with autism. He's on the autism spectrum. And so I come from a very wide variety of a background. I'm also a mixed Native and white woman who presents white. When you first look at me, I kind of right here. So I do have a little bit of a very diverse perspective and background on that. I am, as I said, mixed, but I am not Latino. So I'm here to present information on disabilities and some background statistics that you might find fascinating. And I do have some resources that I put together too towards the end. So I'm going to go ahead and try to share my screen here. So give me just a moment to put up the presentation. And I just have to move a few things around here. Oops. There we go. Okay, so what I'm going to start off with is that a lot of people are not familiar what exactly is a disability. So we're going to talk a little bit about that to have a little bit better understanding on what that might be. So first off, 1990, in July of 1990, President Bush had signed into the act, the Disability Act. And in 2008, Obama then updated that. And so with that, it became the Americans with Disability Amendment Act. And I'm going to read a little bit here where it says disability is defined as a person who has a physical or mental impairment that sustainably limits one or more major life activities. This is based more on a legal term than a medical term. It is considered those who have a history of, and that's something that got changed over the time. And then if you are perceived as a person with having a disability, this was to broader protect those individual disabilities and not overlook those who might be. One of the things that some people really wouldn't know too is what looks like a disability. What is a disability? And it can be anywhere from anybody that has fibromyalgia, chronic migraines like myself, cancer, diabetes, cystic fibrosis, to mental health conditions, to celiac disease, heart disease, rheumatoid arthritis, autoimmune disorders, being on the spectrum by autism spectrum. We'll also have that PTSD, ADHD. So there's a long list of disabilities that are protected under the ADA. So you might be a person saying, well, I had something at one time and it's been controlled by medication, but then you have a flare up. Then you, since you have a history of, then you'd still be considered a person with a disability. So does anybody know what would be considered a major life activity? So one of the things is that it has to impair a major life activity. And if you haven't any of that, you can put that in the chat. And a lot of that can be trying to drive, that can be you know, even walking and running, and simple tasks is try to bathe and eat, to just trying to tie your shoe. So it's a huge variety of lists that was also expanded in 2008. And I'm going to move on to the next slide. So as Steve had mentioned, that it's roughly about 1 in 4 of Americans will have a disability. And something that I'm usually say, it's not if, it's when. You will at some point in your life have a disability. It's just you don't know exactly when that might happen. And so when you start thinking of disabilities and knowing that at some point in your life it could happen, you're going to want to start asking yourself, how do I want people to think of me? How do I want people to remember me? What am I good at? You know, these are the things that you want for yourself to think about when we do start moving through the world of disabilities and talking about it in broader terms. So there's roughly about 300, sorry, this is a number that always gets me, 300 million individuals with disabilities in the United States. And the interesting thing is that it goes up a million every single year. And so it's vastly growing. It is the largest minority population out there. And it continues to grow, especially when people are aging. That also is taken into effect in looking at the disability population. Roughly 16% of people with disabilities will only have a bachelor's degree, compared to 39% without a disability. 38% of people with disabilities are employed, while only 78% of people without disabilities are employed. And this is across the US. And then 25% of people with disabilities will live in poverty, while only 11% of people without disabilities will live in poverty. So you can see the huge discrepancy here. I mean, this is a large discrepancy. They'll have people with disabilities typically will have a higher level of health inequity, just because that they're constantly having to go to the doctor in order to maintain any sense of normalcy when if it comes to medication, if it comes to physical therapy, anything that they can have in order to maintain what the status quo of life is, that society has deemed to be the status quo. The other thing that is interesting is that over 50% of people with disabilities are actually on Medicaid and Medicare. And so they have a choice to make if it comes to employment or not. And that's why you might see the employment levels the way that they are, is because there's a choice that they have to make. And that is, if I work, I'll lose my medical. And if I can't work, if I don't have medical, and if I go for private medical and pay for that, that's going to be more than what I make in the long run. And so it's a cyclical cycle that winds up happening, that winds up keeping people with disabilities in a very much of a poverty level. I'm going to pause here, and I'm going to now move on to the next slide. So this is where it gets a little bit fascinating. This is the disability statistics in Washington. This one, 478,000, 18 to 64. So we're looking at just the working age alone. Those that are able to look for employment are people with disabilities in Washington. And then here is the population for the Latinos, Hispanics in Washington in total is close to 1 million. And out of that number, that are, this is not between the working ages of 18 to 64. This is from the time the person is born to the time the person passes away. Only 81,361 individuals are claiming to be a person with a disability. They're identifying as a disability. So this number here, we can take a look at and realize that for the national average, it's not meeting that 1 in 4. And so there's some underreporting going on here, and we're trying to take a look at why is that? Why is it that there's some underreporting here? And then this is where it gets a little bit more interesting in the scope of the statistics portion of it. For the Latino working population that are disabled between 18 to 64, approximately there's 46,579 that are in that working age. We're not saying that they're working at this time. Now, if we break it down even further in those numbers, only 24,000 are currently working. And those are people identifying as a person with a disability. I do want to back up just a little bit, and these are the ones that are reporting their disabilities. So you can see that there's some underrepresentation possibly going on here. And so that's part of the situation that we're looking at. Overall, we have 21% of people with disabilities living in poverty in Washington, and that's everybody, while only 8.9% people without disabilities are living in poverty in Washington state. When it comes to ranking individuals on how each state does hiring people with disabilities, we rank 20th. And sometimes that number is a little iffy if you start looking at states that are least populated compared to Washington state and so forth. But at this point that we're looking to be about 20th. And looking at the 10-year time frame of people with disabilities, we've remained pretty stagnant. So our numbers haven't really gone up, and they really haven't gone down. And here's the other interesting thing, that if we want to assume that everybody's disclosing and identifying their disabilities, we'd approximate for state workers, which we have about 66,000, maybe a little less state workers now. If everybody were to disclose their disability freely, our workforce would be about 17,000 state employees with a disability. And so that is if everybody felt comfortable enough and the culture was accepting enough, that would be about 17,000. So there's some numbers for you to really kind of put in your head, the 1 in 4 again. The employee engagement survey for 2020 was overall interesting on its own. This year we had about 44,000 state employees that volunteered to take and participate in the employee engagement survey. And out of that survey, and in total, we had 4,441 identify as a person with a disability. And that is actually higher than what the HRMS is reporting. And I think it's because with the employee engagement survey, you're completely anonymous. And so it's nothing to tie you back to that individual person. Out of that, so that's roughly about 10%. Employee engagement survey data shows that 1,664 identifies Latino and Hispanic. And then it breaks it down even further. Out of those 1,664, roughly 174 reported that they were a person with a disability. And we can kind of see that both numbers might be indicating some form of underreporting. So here I'm going to talk a little bit about children. I am a firm believer that everything starts in school age. Sometimes can be the dictation of where you're going to end up with an adult and how that's going to be perceived onto you. So for me, I'm very big on education and properly getting that correct education and services that you need in school. When I did a lot of my advocacy work, I did a lot of work with the IEPs, which is the Individual Education Plan, and the 504, which is another plan out of the Rehabilitation Act for students with disabilities. And so I'm a big firm believer that it starts there. So if we want to see how we can address the population, we kind of want to see where the discrepancies lie and what's kind of going on. And so this is the national average. This isn't pertaining to Washington State in general. We have a 26% of Latino Hispanic children ages 3 to 5 with a disability, and that's preschool to 5 before they hit kindergarten. You know, so number will go up slightly when kindergarten does come around, and that is 27% for 16-21. 21 is that if you are a person with a disability, you can remain in high school until the age of 21. That is the legal right that you have. Here is where it gets troubling. And I want to preface the fact that there is well-known biases in special education amongst BIPOC individuals, that we can see that there's more discipline, incorrect diagnosis, just diagnosing them for any situation instead of looking at what the real cause of a child might be having struggles in. It may be nothing to do with disabilities. It could be, you know, social economic situations going on. There could be some type of domestic violence going on in the home, food insecurities. There's so much more that goes on that can keep children from actually sitting still and paying attention. But often schools will go for the quickest and easiest label instead of addressing the situation. So there's well-known documentation and research that is done behind the bias in special education, especially in this community. And so what most Latino kids wind up going in special ed for, which isn't surprising for a lot of people, is speech and language impairment, along with specific learning disabilities. We're the highest in Latino Hispanic population. That number there, you take a step back and you look at that and you hear that and you're like, well, yeah, I mean, you're putting them in you're labeling them as special ed because English could be their second language. It may not be. You know, we do know that the learning disabilities, the specific learning disabilities can be anywhere from ADHD, hyperactivity, not being able to focus, reading comprehension. I mean, it's a very broad label. And when we see that, it just kind of takes you a step back because it's, in my opinion, causing that labeling that some people take into adulthood. Here's the other thing is that 60% of Latino children from 6 to 21 were mainstreamed in classroom 80% of the time. So mainstreaming in special education world is they split their time between the special education room and then the quote unquote regular classroom with the rest of the students that do not have disabilities. And we find that there's also a bias in doing in the mainstreaming too. Sometimes they feel that it's just easier to keep them isolated and then mainstreaming them into classrooms. And unfortunately, that can cause long-term problems in the long run. Not saying that special education is bad, but there needs to be something to start addressing the situation. When it comes to disciplinary removal from school for individuals with special education, and especially within the BIPOC community, we see that 75% of the Black students are removed and out of school completely from special education, and that's their form of discipline. When it comes to Latino and Hispanic children, it's 24%. And if we're thinking about that, that's 24% of students being removed out of the classroom, out of school completely, which leaves the parents then trying to find a different school and a different way to provide education for their child that the states mandate that your children be in school. So we're finding that there's this huge problematic and this huge situation that's going on, and discrepancies that are going on that need to be addressed. And it's very difficult when we see that a lot of students are being misdiagnosed. So some of the other things with disability and culture, we do know that disabilities can be viewed differently in different cultures. And so I know within within my Native population, myself speaking, certain things are okay to talk about, certain things aren't. Physical disabilities, we do embrace those, but we also put those out in the community. And then, but when it comes to mental health, we're less likely to talk about that. And almost every community across the board are less likely to talk about any type of mental health situation. And that's why I find Renee's story so powerful, because he's talking about it. And he's a male that's also talking about it, because we know that's a population on its own that do not talk about their disabilities. And so there's a lot of underreporting going on in that area too. But in some cultures, family orientation is very important. They keep it in the family. They don't want to talk about it outside of the family. Sometimes that can lead to still stigmatizing the situation that's going on at hand and the type of disability that that individual may or may not have. There is a high level of belief that school officials and doctors and counselors and psychiatrists are the final authority, because it's this view that that is their job. What would I know? I'm just going to go along with what they recommend to me. Unfortunately, this can lead, and it has been shown, and I've worked with communities that this has happened to, they get bullied. And so they get bullied into accepting what is being handed to them by either the doctor or the school officials or the instructors there. And so there's not a lot of questions being asked or answered, and just a lot of going along with it, which sometimes can lead to some long-term effects, especially into adulthood. There's this need not wanting to cause waves or having a high level of compliance towards authority figures. Again, well, what would I know? And again, it leads down to bullying sometimes. And like I said, I've worked with that and I've seen that firsthand, and it's pretty astonishing when how that happens. Sometimes I've found that depending on any type of documentation status that an individual may or may not have, the less waves, the happier. And so we see that going into the communities too, where whatever the school wants to do, that's fine by me. And the other thing that we've also noticed is that the understanding is limited in IEPs and 504s and ADA. I mean, there is so much legally language there that it really takes a long time to completely understand it. And so sometimes being able to translate that in any community to a level that this are your rights, this is what you can and can't do, this is what you can do, this is how you go about taking care of the situation, is often limited because it's not meant for most people to even understand. Sometimes in certain communities, religion can have a high impact on viewpoints about disabilities overall and how to handle them and what's acceptable and not. And lastly, and I'm from a generation that might be different from some, discipline. You discipline the disability out of you. And the focus, the lack of sitting still, the inability, to get those straight A's, even though in your mind saying I'm going to get straight A's, the likelihood of C's is what's coming out. And where is that mishap? Where is that disconnect that's going on? And so that we see that with me, I was, for many years disciplined for not behaving like the rest of the students in the classroom, instead of trying to figure out why. And so, and then I would get, bad report, go home, and then, my mom would have to deal with that. So a little bit about moving forward and how can we move forward as a community? How can we overall start destigmatizing disabilities across the board, and especially mental health? How can we do that in different communities? How can we start making it more acceptable to be and talk about what is who you are, instead of having to kind of brush that aside? And so moving forward, getting to a place where you can talk about disabilities more comfortably, because again, that's part of who you are, that's part of your identity. It shouldn't be something that should be pushed aside or hush hush, because you know what, sometimes you just have bad days. Sometimes you need to talk, and depending on when that time frame in your life that you obtain a disability, sometimes there's a mourning period that goes through that. If, for an example, if you decide to go to the grocery store and getting in that car and you wind up getting into a severe car accident, and let's say you're paralyzed from the waist below, well, that's a whole new you that you have to get used to. And you have to be able to talk about that, because there's depression that goes on. There's a mourning period that goes on, because who you were is not who you are now And there's some things that you may be limited by. And I say may because, people are wonderful beings, and sometimes they can just push right through and continue the life that they had before. But these are a lot of things that winds up happening. Redefine what a disability looks like and the ability that people bring to the table. So when people do go look for jobs and they do interview, try not to look at that person with a disability, but what is it they're bringing to this organization? What are they bringing to this job that is just going to benefit everybody in the long run? Sometimes taking that, and I hate to say this, chance could be the best thing that you ever did and the best thing for that organization. And the last one, or the third one I should say, is advocate. Advocate, advocate, advocate. If you are a person that knows and understands the IEPs and the 504 and the ADAs and the ideas and everything that goes around disabilities, be willing to be that advocate, or at least provide those resources that individual might need to empower that person to advocate for themselves and sometimes their children or the neighbor or their relatives. Advocate can be your best tool into bringing change and starting to destigmatize. Take the stigma out of disabilities. Again, I'm going to highlight that over and over. It's important to start taking that stigma out so that people can bring themselves to their authentic selves, and then recognize disabled Latino celebrities, co-workers, activists. I mean, there's important people in communities that you can reach out to that may have some of the best resources and can advocate on your behalf. There could be co-workers who are just, doing wonderful things, amazing activists out there right now. Tune into what they're doing, and start getting involved in that. And one of my favorite things is, did you know? I love this type of segments because it's a did you know? And so we start recognizing things that we may or may not know in certain cultures. And so Selma Hayek has actually come out as a person who has pretty severe who's dyslexic and has depression. Selena Gomez, she has lupus, and that's a very painful, debilitating disease. And Frida herself, she was, is a person that had polio and then got to an accident, and then we have hip and pelvis problems from then on out too. Victor Pendia, I think I said the last name right. I don't know. I apologize. One of the best activists I've ever got a chance to read about. If you want to know more or anything about what's going on, he is brilliant in his activism and how he's done great things for the disability rights movement here in the United States too. And it's just, I would definitely look into him. And then other individuals is, let's see, Frida Sophia, she has PTSD. Demi has bipolar. And then Lewis Cornell's has anxiety and depression. And so when we start looking at what more we can do, the disability portion starts to melt away. And so with that, my presentation is done. I do have references here, and I also do have some resources that I did make up and have it provided to.
Thank you so much, Jocelyn.
Thank you.
And our final presenter today is Flora Estrada. Flora.
Hello, everyone. Like I was just presenting, my name is Flora Estrada, and I'm with the Office of Financial Management. I am a Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Innovations Manager. And I'm going to try to be brief because I know we're running out of time, and I want to create some space for you to ask questions. So I am going to try to highlight my experience with my son that has ADHD and some of the points that Jocelyn was talking about. At an early age, he started having signs of having some problems with being able to pronounce some words or having the ability to say things. So I made the decision that I regret on not teaching him Spanish, because I believe that by him only speaking one language, it will be easier for him to actually interact with society and interact with the world. So I made the wrong decision, I say now, of no teaching him the two languages and taking something away from him. And I say this because when my son started school, He was actually put into English as a second language program instead of identifying that he had ADHD. And he started to go to the curriculum as English as a second language learner, we never really speaking a different language. He has always been an English speaker because I took that other option for him. And as Jocelyn was mentioning, sometimes kids are misdiagnosed. um, I don't believe the intent from the school, from the staff at the school, was to misdiagnose my child into having a learning disability relating to language instead of actually recognizing ADHD. Um, Also, he started having some discipline problems at school. And instead of addressing it as being part of a symptom to his ADHD, it was more as just being somebody like they had just out of control. It didn't have discipline. And I think in my community, I am of Mexican descendants. It's often seen as discipline being so important as part of our culture. And as a parent, I didn't have the right tools or how to provide the right system for my kid. So I led somebody else's perception of what I needed to do for my kid drive the decisions that I was making instead of providing him with the right support, instead of advocating for him, instead of asking for the right resources to make sure he was getting what he needed. Um, I want to touch on what Renee was saying about family is so important to have empathy for somebody that is going through this discovering of their disability is so important to be supported. And especially when we're talking about kids, like we are the ones that can advocate for them. We are the ones that can actually represent them in some of these spaces. And my lack of understanding of the system, I didn't advocate appropriately for my child. I didn't um, ask for resources. I didn't ask the right questions. And I was overwhelmed with everything that was happening without really asking what is it that my kid needs instead of just driving all the decisions with the information that was providing for me. Um, so if you a couple things I would like for you to walk away today is don't don't feel that somebody other's expertise can determine how much you can advocate for those that you love. They have a disability. Make sure you continue to advocate for them. Make sure you look for resources. If you don't understand processes, continue to ask questions. What matters here is how do you create the right environment for that loved one instead of if you feel that you're imposing somebody else, and how do you do that, right? How do you continue to advocate for them and create a good environment? I think for myself, I wish I would have intervened sooner and provided my kid with the right tools. um, One of the things I want to touch really quick is my nephew was diagnosed with autism, and I feel I'm a better equipped advocate for him. And I can help my sister navigate the systems, and I can help my sister ask the right questions. However, I did discover that oftentimes these conversations is still taboo. Um, I asked her permission to be able to speak on this presentation about my nephew having autism. And what I discovered, it is still a sense of a taboo that we don't talk about it, that we don't say like, there's a condition, and having this type of condition doesn't make you be normal. Is we have to normalize that we're different, that we're unique, that we bring different perspectives without having norms that kind of guide what is acceptable and what is not. um, I do have to say that for him it has been really challenging. For my nephew has been really challenging to be on online schooling. And we have to discover how to help him again, how to interact with the world in this environment where he has to do all his social interactions through the computer, when he worked so hard to be able to have social interactions with other kids in the classroom. And how do we continue to advocate to the schools of saying he needs something different, this is not working, how do we try a different approach? So like I say again, advocate for those that you love. Don't settle for the options that you are given at the first time. If the healthcare providers that you're looking at are not helping you with the resources that those people with disability that are part of your life need, continue to look for second opinions or third opinions. And I will give it back to you, Steve, because I do want to create some space for questions.
Thank you so much, Flora. Really appreciate it. Um, we do have a couple questions that were placed in the chat that I'd like to address here. And as I'm doing so, please, if anybody else has questions, remember that we'll also take them through raising your hand. The first question, Jocelyn, this will be directed towards you. Kate Cross asked, are late readers considered disabled? If so, it may just be the individual variation than truly a disability.
So that's a double-edged sword there. So everything in the disability world, well, it varies, and so it late readers aren't typically considered a person with a disability if at the time that they've learned how to read that they become what they considered on target from that point on. And so some people just take a little longer, like language. Some people don't start talking until 3 or 4. They still wouldn't be considered a child with a disability, just because from that point on there has been no continuing issues. Now, if they became a late reader but still have reading comprehension issues or other type of issues that affect their reading, then at that point that child probably or might have a disability, considered a learning disabled individual.
Thank you. Lizette
Steve, if you
Bigelow?
may, I add something really quick.
Sure,
And
sure.
Jocelyn, you're always like great at talking more about disabilities, but it's really understanding that some of the conditions have a spectrum. And even though maybe it's not the medical term when it comes to ADHD, in my personal opinion, ADHD and autism are spectrums, right? So the environment and other factors that are happening in the individual's life can change how much it's affecting them. And it's really like trying to measure that, right? What is the effect that has in individuals in their day-to-day life to really determine if it is a disability or not.
Great, thank you. Another mention here to people before I say the next question regarding the survey. We would like everybody that's in attendance, if you're willing to take the survey, and Victor put that in the chat, but I will drop it in here in just a moment. Lizette Bigelow asked, will we be getting a recording of this webinar? I believe the answer is yes. We will be assembling everybody that has attended, and we can send that out. Rachel G asked, any input from fellow state employees who have a disability that requires accommodation? How do you balance getting access without feeling like you're a bit of a burden? Oh, this is a really good one. Really good one.
I'll go ahead and answer that briefly, and then let Flora and Renee answer that. I think the first thing that we need to do is not consider yourself a burden. And I think you need to reframe that and consider that differently. These are accommodations, which mainly is their adjustments to your job. If you, let's say, didn't need a reasonable accommodation, but you needed a darker screen for some whatever reason, or you had to switch work hours because your kid had an appointment, you wouldn't consider, that's not considered a burden. And so I kind of want to encourage you to readjust your thinking on that, and allow yourself that grace, and realize that these are adjustments to allow you to do your job to the fullest, like everybody else. And so I just encourage you to take it from that approach.
What I would like to add is for those of us, because I don't think I have disclosed it in this space, they have a disability. I actually have PTSD and have been diagnosed with chronic depression that is tied to the PTSD. We need to speak up. We need to normalize it. We need to have conversations, especially when we're talking about invisible disabilities, whenever we're talking about mental health. Really, like, how do we do preventive medicine to mental health? How do we actually have these conversations instead of keeping everything inside? And whenever we normalize these conversations, even in the workspace, it is not really about feeling like you are burdened to ask for reasonable accommodations. It's expected of individuals to ask for the tools that you need to be successful in your work. And that's the approach that we need to take. And it takes all of us, right? Those that have disabilities to speak up, and those that don't have a disabilities to have empathy and understanding, and create an environment that it's okay to request those reasonable accommodations.
I would like to add that as leaders, our job is to take care of our people. I mean, that's first and foremost, that's what we do. And in my case, I was told to look at getting FEMLA, which initially I didn't think about doing. I just felt like it wasn't something that one I wanted to do. Again, going back to this pride mentality. But I did go to HR. I did get approved for FEMLA. Very supportive with my supervisors in terms of if I do need to use it. And basically, what happens is if I'm in extreme pain, I go home because I need to lay down and not move my face or not deal with certain things. But I think some people may have a stigma about FEMLA, and I think I did at first. And I would encourage people not to look at it as a negative thing, or that it's going to hurt your career, or that you're not going to be able to be looked at the same way. I guarantee you, I am still considered a wonderful person, a wonderful employee, just because I have this. It doesn't change anything. And Alfie has been supportive. My supervisor, David, has been great. So again, just speaking, you have options that are out there available to you. Do not be afraid to take advantage of them.
And that's part of, again, like I mentioned at the intro today, that's part of the reason why we're doing this today is education. It's enlightenment. It's hopefully inspiration. It's getting people to talk about these things. It's the 1 in 4 number. 25% of Americans have a disability. This isn't something that's as hidden as it currently is. We need to talk about these things. We need to normalize these things, and we need to focus on abilities, and the disabilities we need to quit hiding. That's my spiel into it. With that,
We have another question, Martha.
Yeah.
Yes, I have a question, and my question is, how can the schools help better the students with disabilities?
That's hard. I think that part of the problem that we're having is the schools are underfunded and not enough staff to provide students with what they need from the teachers. But I also think that knowing your rights as a parent, and then later on in life knowing your rights as an adult, and then teaching your children especially their rights, because at some point, especially at the age of 13, they're going to be part of if they're still have an IEP or a 504, which is the individual education plan, they have to attend these. And so they also need to start learning to advocate for themselves and knowing who they are. They're going to know what they want. They're going to know what they need, because that is, who they are. So I think that is the biggest point here still, is to advocate. So if I know these rights and say my neighbor's child is having difficulties in school, they're finding that there's not enough support, then at that point I go and advocate with my neighbor. I do have currently a neighbor. English is not her first language. She's from Korea. And the doctors are doing what bullying her, saying that she was not allowed to do X, Y, and Z. And I said, that's not actually correct. And so I went with her to advocate on her behalf, because I do happen to know the laws. And so when we start doing that, we form a community. And then we form, more educated individuals who then can feel empowered. And so empowerment is huge. Here in Washington State, we do pretty well providing programs like parent to parent to preschool age. We're pretty quick to diagnose. It's just you have to stay on top of it. You literally have to stay on top of it every step of the way.
And again, before everybody clicks out of the meeting today, as we are 2 minutes from 1, please do scroll up in the chat and go to the link for the survey. We would like everybody to take the survey. Definitely so much. We thank everybody today. And this is it's only a first start, but we've been educated. We've heard these stories. And from this, it's a stair step. We can keep going up the steps. We can keep learning. We can keep advocating. But it's so important that we do get exposed, so we're not ignorant, and we can advocate for everybody else, and we can make everybody's lives more rich. Thank you everyone for attending today. It's been our pleasure having you. And again, thank you to Jocelyn, Renee, and Flora. Everybody enjoy your weekend, and thank you for attending.
Really quick, Steve, I
Question.
think
Absolutely.
we have people
Question.
that's asking about how can they submit more questions. So if you can answer that really quick.
So one way you can do it, Jocelyn put down her email there. I will put down my email in the chat, and I can
Yeah, we can put down the emails.
cascade it to Jocelyn as well.
Yeah. And then the other thing is something that we can do is, DIN, the Disability Inclusion Network and Latino Leadership Network can also form any type of, partnership there when it comes to disabilities and anything like that. So keep DIN in mind too if you have any questions in the long run, and pair up and we can work together on getting more information out.
And it looks like we have email addresses for Jocelyn, Flora, myself, Renee. So email anybody and everybody, and we'll get you answers to you. Thank you all so much for attending today. It's been our pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.